Welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Mark Silver. I am a forensic psychiatric social worker in New York. My specialty is criminal mitigation, both for criminal lawyers and also for immigration defense lawyers. I've done thousands of cases. I've been in New York working here as an expert since 2002. And I'm going to talk about what I think is perhaps the single most important issue for criminal defense lawyers in evaluating cases, and that is the subject of complex trauma. Complex trauma refers to a key criminal mitigation issue for criminal defense lawyers because it considers not a single incident of harm or trauma that the client may have experienced in childhood or adolescence, but rather repeated incidents of physical, emotional, verbal, and other kinds of abuses and or neglect. And how this complex trauma, how these repeated harms negatively influences the client, that really causes abnormal development. It undermines the person's normal development. It jeopardizes their healthy pathway. And these pathological stresses make it impossible for the person to grow in a safe and healthy manner. I have two books which I always try to talk about a little bit. This is Handbook of Mitigation in Criminal and Immigration Forensics, and I have a chapter here on complex trauma. And I also mentioned this in more recent years, the psychosocial evaluation and consultation civil litigation. It's really for all lawyers. But I mention it because in law school, we're not taught how to evaluate a client. We're not taught how to elicit information, particularly from clients that have very serious psychological or emotional issues. They've suffered overwhelming stresses and so on. And the second book really outlines for the lawyer how to approach the client, what challenges may arise, how to contend with difficult clients, and so on. I think these are absolutely essential programs. I've done these as CLEs for tens of thousands of lawyers throughout the United States, and I've been very fortunate to work with many of them. I've tried to encourage major national programs, organizations, including National Organization of Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, and major state programs that coordinate with criminal defense lawyers to have these programs as CLEs. They don't always do it. I've done several, but I'm putting them on the internet on YouTube so that they're available for free and anybody can take a look at them. I really try to integrate theory with practice, and for that reason, please don't hesitate to send me an email and I'll send you back a redacted copy. Just put the words complex trauma in the subject line, and I'll send you back a redacted copy of one or more cases. I have several complex trauma redacted cases. I won't send you spam email, I promise. Just send all your name, all your information, office, phone number, and so on, because I just want to make sure it's a real attorney I'm working with. But the idea really is to integrate the programs that I have on my PowerPoint outlines that I use when I teach in CLE formats, and be able to integrate it with real cases that have real human beings whose history of challenges and traumas, deficits, failings, all sorts of negative experiences that the person has experienced adversely affect their development. And this is what we're going to be focusing on today. So first, what is complex trauma? It describes both children's exposure to severe and pervasive multiple traumatic events such as abuse or neglect, repeated and chronic stressors, often of an invasive or interpersonal nature, and the wide-ranging long-term effects of this exposure to a child's emotional and neurological development, harming the child's ability to self-regulate emotions or other key issues in their lives, especially when there's pathologically high levels of stress that the person has been exposed to. A caregiver's bond is normally the fundamental source of stability, safety, certainty, and security in a child's life, and the lack of a healthy and reliable primary attachment can fundamentally undermine the child's development. There are certain red flags when you see a client as a criminal defense lawyer, for me as a criminal mitigation expert, that focuses you much more strongly towards considering complex trauma. First, very obviously in every death penalty case or where there's murder or very serious crimes in general, one really wonders if this person has not been exposed to overwhelming harm as a child. In general, any client with multiple arrests, particularly beginning at a relatively early age, it's really also a red flag for complex trauma. Next, don't assume your client doesn't have complex trauma, even with white-collar cases. In other words, you see a guy who's, gone to school, college, they seem to have had a career, family, they participated in various community events. Don't assume that because this person presents in a very healthy way that they did not suffer repeated and serious harms as a child. Clients from deprived, dysfunctional, or chaotic homes or communities should also be considered for complex trauma. Those who have suffered systemic abuses or neglect, obviously. Abused spouses or partners very often find themselves in situations or become abusers because of complex trauma that they experienced at very early stages in life. And finally, and we have a completely separate CLE on this regarding borderline personality disorder, and I have a book on it, but clients who are clearly self-destructive, clients who undermine their own best interests, repeatedly jeopardize their well-being, that's another red flag for a client that may be suffering from complex trauma due to serious harms as a child. Another major red flag in general, and as I said, I have a separate CLE on this, is borderline personality disorder. Probably about 1/3 of all people with borderline personality disorder have suffered sexual abuse or other kinds of harms as a child or adolescent, or even young adult. The next area is sex crimes. It's not unusual for a person in this category to have suffered not just physical or emotional abuse, but sexual abuse themselves in one form or another. Next, clients with very odd presentations. Those clients that seem very disorganized, clients that seem that they have chronic difficulty with focus, they're hyperactive, impulsive, they don't seem to be able to process information very well. This is another individual who may be presenting with a red flag for someone that has suffered these kinds of severe and repetitive harms in childhood. Also, some clients who present with multiple chronic somatic issues without clear etiology. In other words, clients that have chronic complaints regarding stomach problems, I just don't feel well, my tummy's always hurting. Clients who have off and on again headaches or even migraine headaches, which can be quite debilitating. Clients that have chronic hair loss, dermatological problems, and so on. And clients who have general complaints about their health and well-being, but that they just can't seem to quite put their finger on it. Usually when you have a problem, the doctor asks you, can you take your finger in, like your tummy or wherever, can you put your finger on the area really where it hurts, where it seems to be aching? And many clients in this category cannot do that because the pain, the discomfort that they're experiencing psychologically, emotionally, is also reflected physically in a more generalized way. And lastly, clients that are hypomanic in their presentation, not just behaviorally, but in terms of their thinking, flight of ideas, and so on, suggests that they may have suffered complex trauma. I've done this in other programs, but I'll just quickly review the legal basis for mitigation. We all know that from 18 U.S.C. 3553A, court shall impose a sentence sufficient but not greater than necessary to comply with the purposes of the statute. We also know from 3661 that no limitation shall be placed on the information concerning the background, character, and conduct of a person convicted of an offense which a court of the United States may receive and consider for the purpose of imposing an appropriate sentence. This will afford the prosecutor and judge to consider and understand the client's psychosocial issues as legal mitigating factors rather than simply background information established for the sake of general argument. That is, criminal mitigation is not simply an effective tool for the sake of argument, but a necessary factual underpinning to support the factors in 18 U.S.C. 3553A and other relevant case law. So this is all the more important for complex trauma because there's often a wealth of information from the person's childhood which reflects a wide range of harms that help inform the person's judgment, the person's decision-making, and ultimately, and hopefully we'll have time to get to this, the person's value system. Through these evaluations of complex trauma, we want to humanize the client through a sympathetic narrative, inducing empathy for the reader, explaining the client's history, contextualizing his conduct, obviously showing contrition. We want to document the client's life history not in a desultory or negative way, but reflecting the reality of the harms that individual has experienced. So the mitigation report, it's not just a mental health report, it's not a psych report. It's holistic. It looks at a broad range of issues, bringing into this as a single document many important influences, including educational issues, developmental, employment issues, and so on. A very important issue here, because a lot of these clients are so disorganized with complex trauma, we want to disabuse the parties of bias and prejudice and assumptions that they may have about the client. And this is something I speak about in other programs as well. We want to also counter the PSI. I have a completely separate CLE and program I'm putting on YouTube about it. So many of these PSI, so many of the probation officer reports I see are just so terribly deficient when it comes to psychiatric issues, family, psychosocial, development harms, and so on. And all that needs to be rectified through a great criminal mitigation report, and particularly so when the client has suffered a history of such severe harms that it rises to complex trauma. All of this is gathered through a psychosocial evaluation, which is basically a biopsychosocial evaluation. It's conducted to determine if there are any factors that would explain how the client has come to be in his current situation, with particular consideration for multiple issues, including the strengths and weaknesses, the vulnerability of the client and his background, general childhood experiences, the quality of relationships to immediate and extended family members, sometimes called family dynamics, the health and well-being of the client, including clearly psychopathology, interaction with his environment and community in the context of education, employment, socialization. Very importantly, current stressors that have been affecting him for the last couple of months or years, but major childhood stressors and traumas as well. All this to humanize the client. The study of brain scans, genetics, neurophysiology all have amazing merit and can be very informative. But the truth is we humanize the client and understand his environment, culture, and family experiences through a clinical, detailed psychosocial evaluation. And again, I said this at the beginning, this is what we miss in law school, whether it's in this area or, personal injury, where you really need to understand a client's life and experience to understand how this current injury or incident of medical malpractice has negatively affected the client. We don't learn in school how to elicit this kind of information, how to connect, how to gain the client's trust, and without that, we will get less than a full picture. One major way in recent years that people have conceptualized childhood harms is through ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. There's an article in The Champion about this from 2019 and in other places as well. Adverse childhood experiences looks at maladaptive risk behaviors that emerge from negative life experiences, including physical, sexual, emotional abuse, physical and emotional neglect, intimate partner violence in the home, if the client's mother was violently mistreated, if there's substance abuse in the home, household mental health issues, parental separation or divorce, and if there have been incarcerated household members. It's an excellent tool to use because childhood experiences, both positive and negative, have a tremendous impact on future decision-making, behavior, emotional stability, and security that the client may or may not experience. If there are a lot of adverse childhood experiences that the individual suffers in childhood, it leads to risk health behaviors, chronic health conditions, low life potential, early death, and all kinds of other very serious negative outcomes. Many of these clients have serious alcohol or substance abuse addiction, psychiatric issues and disorders, chronic physical illness, as I spoke about before a little bit. They may themselves become very poor parents to their own children. They may have overt interpersonal challenges within family or the workplace. They are often themselves become involved in the criminal justice system in one way or another. And these are all very important considerations. I just want to mention one or two things that are very crucial to understand as qualifying issues here. One is that the ACE considerations, the adverse childhood experience considerations, can affect individuals who are not poor, not a minority, and living in a safe and healthy community. Think white-collar cases. And I've seen many white-collar cases where individuals who you would not think has experienced childhood harms because the person seems to be living very properly in a upper middle class neighborhood, they went to college, they have a good job and family, don't make assumptions in white-collar cases about the person's background in life. The second major caveat about ACEs in general is that the severity of a single incident can be systemically damaging. Complex trauma, as I said at the beginning, considers repeated harms that the child experiences in early life. And that's true, but the child can experience a single incident of harm that can be systemically damaging, sometimes above and beyond or separate to the other complex trauma issues. I'll just give you one example. I've seen 1,000 domestic violence cases. Almost all domestic violence is private within the home, including verbal domestic violence. And I would see these cases where the woman has been verbally abused dozens and dozens and dozens, hundreds of times over many months or years. And she almost collapses all of these examples of verbal abuse because she can't remember them all. And then she says, I remember one day I was out with my husband and our families from a birthday, and we were in a restaurant, and my husband became verbally abusive. He was verbally degrading towards me, put me down, called me stupid. She says, that I'll never forget. And I said, why is that? And it's because it's qualified by a single incident that was so damaging because she was so horribly embarrassed that her family was there. In other words, it's not that she wasn't harmed by the verbal abuse in the months and years prior to this, but the context of this particular moment of verbal abuse was systemically damaging because of the shame she felt. Next is microaggressions can lead to systemically damaging harm. In other words, relatively minor harms, physical, emotional, psychological, verbal, and others, even sexual, that may not seem so overtly serious can add up to systemically damaging harm over many years. Next, people perceive and are affected by abuse and harm in idiosyncratic ways. And it's very important to understand objectively what we need to conceptualize about the harm that this person has suffered, but also subjectively how this person experienced the supposed harm when that person was very young, and even now how subjectively the person retrospectively considers the harm looking back many years before. Next, there's resilience. Some people are very resilient when it comes to adversity. They have an ability to overcome, put aside problems. They sometimes compartmentalize harms in a certain part of their head and they move on, then they can be successful in school and in other areas. Just because the person's resilient doesn't mean that the person didn't suffer serious harms in childhood. And one of the rules about serious harm in childhood is that it always comes out somewhere. The trauma always manifests in some way through the person in later years having a chronic irritability or anger or interpersonal friction or a chronic sense of guardedness or hypervigilance about not feeling trust in relationships and so on. The last thing I'd mention is that there's also the issue of intergenerational harm. This is extremely important for clients who've been in families that have suffered, for example, racism for generations, where there are, significant impacts on the individual, which doesn't rest and stay with the individual, but is passed to the next generation and even the generation after that in various ways. Another very important issue when it comes to complex trauma, when thinking about adverse childhood experiences with the outline I gave you, is that not all harms are household focused or originate in the household. And I'll give you some examples. One is prenatal. Someone can experience very serious prenatal harms in various ways, including, a parent who's drinking, that could lead to fetal alcohol syndrome, or the parent is using drugs and so on. That's a prenatal issue. It doesn't mean that there's anything necessarily particularly dangerous about the household itself. Another issue is genetics. I have a genetic disorder. It's congenital genetic disorder. Had nothing to do with the household I was brought up in, regardless of where I lived, whatever city, whatever house, whatever I studied in school. It would have been the same genetic disorder. That's not household specific. Another is epigenetic. These are actual chromosomal changes that occur to individuals because of overwhelming stress, and it can be passed on to the next generation. Again, that's not necessarily household specific. Another huge area is education. We want our kids very focused on school. They spend, about half their day there. Then they have homework, school related, school friends. One thing that the adverse childhood experience chart does not look at are physical, emotional, verbal, and even sexual bullying by classmates and peers in school and in the community. And, I've had clients, many clients, who've had all sorts of community stressors in general that have led to trauma, including clients that live in communities where there's the ubiquity of violence, ubiquity of drugs or gangs, prostitution, alcoholism, firearms, and so on. What we want to do now is look at a developmental perspective on complex trauma. As I said before, children must develop in a manner that permits them to gain a sense of well-being in a predictable, certain, safe, healthy, loving, secure environment within the home itself and broadly within the environment, with healthy emotional attachments and physical bonds. Stress because of abuse and neglect prohibits normal developmental milestones, undermining the child's development and future development, and the future is profoundly jeopardized, prohibiting normal and healthy functioning and even interaction with others. And when I say normal developmental milestones, I don't mean just the normal developmental milestones that we expect that children would experience in the first few weeks or few months or even the first few years of their lives. Development is a lifelong phenomenon. That's something we know now. It occurs well into our geriatric years, and even death has stages of development in a sense. And we want to understand how this child has developed negatively or positively, not just at the very, very early stages, but, through, preschool and pre-K and really every year. And the reason I say this is because when we look at adults, if you're 30, the difference in your life between the age 30 and 31, or the difference between your life between age 33 and 35, is often extremely small. You're often very, very set in your job, relationships, and so on. What changes between ages 42 and 44 is probably minimal for most people. That's not true for children. A 7-year-old and a 9-year-old live in different worlds. An 8-year-old and a high schooler live in completely separate worlds, even though it's only a few years apart. There are physical changes, there are physiological changes, there are psychological, emotional changes, there are interpersonal changes, there are changes in learning and neurological development and everything else. I also want to differentiate between abuse and neglect. Abuse really refers to acts of commission. These are almost always deliberate or intentional harm towards a child, physical, emotional, of some kind. Intention implies harshness, and it implies a deliberate act. It's important to understand that abuse tends to be understood in the areas of physical, sexual, psychological abuse by the caregiver, but it can be by other extended people within the home, people within the community, and so on. In fact, in my criminal mitigation cases with immigration defense lawyers, the clients I see, especially from Central and South America, a majority of the sexual abuse that the client suffers in childhood, separate from other childhood trauma, occurs outside of the home, not inside of the home. And it's very important that we balance our evaluations for both. The reason I'm bringing up abuse and neglect is that for some reason, abuse is the darling of these kinds of evaluations, but neglect is also very, very important. Neglect necessarily means acts of omission. This is the failure to provide for a child's needs or to protect a child from harm or potential harm. There could be physical, emotional, medical neglect, educational, inadequate supervision. That's a form of neglect, exposure to violence. Just as abuse can be repeated and chronic, neglect can also be repeated and chronic. I want to give you a great example. And I've seen this many times now. I would see clients, and unfortunately this is more with fathers, who have neglected them. And when I first heard about neglect in my early years, I would think about simple omission. But I would see these clients and they would say, my dad said he was going to pick me up at 4 o'clock on a Friday. My parents weren't living together, and we'd spend a few hours together or spend the weekend together. And 4 o'clock would roll around, and then 4:15 and 4:30 would roll around, 5 o'clock, 5:30. And week after week, month after month, my father would fail to come, or he'd come very, very infrequently. And that child internalized a profound sense of abandonment. Just because the dad doesn't show up, you don't think, well, it's not the worst thing in the world, so he didn't show up. It's not abuse. You're not being harmed. You're not being hit by a belt. But to that child, that sense of abandonment makes the child feel unwanted. The child internalizes a sense of blame. Oh, what did I do? Maybe I did something. It profoundly negatively affects the child's self-esteem, self-concept. It's very, very damaging, neglect, and it needs to be considered along with abuse. There are many risks for victimization of children. There are individual risk factors. Children younger than 4 years of age are more at risk. Special needs children, that is children with disabilities, Particular illnesses, mental health issues may be more at risk. There are also risk factors for perpetration. Parents' lack of understanding of children's needs, child development and parenting skills, a parental history of child abuse and or neglect, substance abuse or mental health issues, including depression in the family history. Another reason why there may be a perpetrator is that the person may have become a parent at a very young age. They may have very little education. They may have had severe stressors because of inadequate finances or monetary support. They may have multiple dependents, and it becomes quite overwhelming for them, and they just can't cope day to day. That's another reason that they may become abusive or neglectful. They may be non-biological transient caregivers in the home. This is very common where people grow up in homes where there are repeated stepfathers, where inevitably one of the stepfathers is abusive in one manner or another. Another major risk factor for victimization is family risk factors, where the family is, for whatever reason, or the individual within the family is socially isolated. The family is disorganized. There's dissolution. Sometimes the parents separate for a few months, get back together, separate again. There may be general violence in the home. There may be intimate partner violence within the home. There may be overwhelming parenting stresses. You may have a mom working 2 jobs, trying to raise 2 children. She's doing her very, very best under difficult circumstances. And at times she becomes overwhelmed and she contends with her issues, maybe not by drinking, maybe not by skipping work, but now and again with some consistency being abusive towards the children. There are community risk factors that we spoke about, particularly those clients who live in inner city, impoverished, lower socioeconomic buildings or communities where there's high unemployment, there's high density, alcohol is used to self-medicate, there are unhealthy social connections, and so on. When these issues occur, the child will feel often very powerless, vulnerable, exploited. They may feel that they're unlovable and they will not love themselves. And it may lead to maladaptive coping behaviors, including even dissociation or emotional detachment. There may be also in later years memories of that experience that trigger dissociation, and memories in general which redirect the client towards an unhealthy lifestyle. Many of these clients are internally agitated. They are hypervigilant. They may have physiological responses such as increased heart rate or increased muscle tone. They may have severe difficulty maintaining an internal state of calm. Like you see these clients and just underneath the surface, they're always just a little bit agitated, always just a little bit hypervigilant and hyper aware of their surroundings, and even when they're interacting with someone who they trust and feel quite comfortable with. Some of these clients develop severe attention problems, bedwetting issues, concentration problems, sexual reactivity and acting out. Many of these clients develop insomnia, depression, eating disorders, and self-mutilation. Some of these clients will feel a sense of apathy, defiance, or aggression, or cruelty, or even rage. Again, this is something hopefully we'll focus on today or in another program. These clients may superficially look quite like they are an antisocial personality disorder or there's psychopathy involved, but it's not. It's really this overwhelming trauma and despair and depression that they've suffered over the years. Some clients grow up in a permanent state of terror, so that there's really permanent neurological changes that they experience, and they never really experience or enjoy a sense of equilibrium again. And you can imagine if a caretaker is constantly stressed out and they're abusive or they're absent and so on, then the child's brain, their neural network cannot develop. There's insufficient nurturing and privation. Bonding and healthy caregiver interaction is critical for ensuring normal brain development. It's critical. It's as critical as having everything else that the child is supposed to have. When a child's needs is not met, pathology ensues. And many of these individuals will have a profound sense of betrayal at its core. And I mentioned this client who, every day, every Friday perhaps, or every second Friday at 4 o'clock, he's waiting for his dad to come. The dad never shows up. That guy grows up feeling very foolish, but he feels very betrayed. And it's not just betrayal because of the father not showing up, but it's betrayal of himself. And what I mean by that is that the client grows up doubting his own judgment, not feeling secure in his own judgments. Sometimes there is a pattern of harm that the child will experience in the context of complex trauma. And I'll give you one example. The dad comes home Friday afternoon. He's gotten his paycheck, he cashes it, and he goes out drinking. And he comes home and he's violent all night, maybe even sexually violent with his wife, which is horrific for the child to know about. And he gets up the next morning having slept in, working off his hangover, maybe hangs out a bit, goes to a bar again, and it happens Saturday night. Sunday morning, the dad may not even remember because he may have had a blackout due to the alcohol abuse. And he sobers up and he knows that Monday morning he has to go back to work. This is a pattern, a set pattern of harm. I have seen this a million times in domestic violence cases. It happens with childhood abuse as well. However, for the most part, there is no set pattern or cycle of abuse. Patterns of abuse may not exist at all. Abusers may act without reason or without known reason. Abusers may act in an arbitrary or capricious manner. There may be blind hatred or even something else such as racism. The abuser may act in a psychopathic, idiopathic, idiosyncratic manner, meaning that the harms that they are forcing on the child or other family members come from their very own personal pathology, which the child may never know about. Some of these cycles of abuse may be very cultural, and some of them may not be very cultural. One of the things that's very important to understand is that if you have a father that goes out every weekend and drinks at night for those 2 days, but is sober for the rest of the week and goes to work and seems responsible, that pattern, even though there's terrible abuse on the weekend, believe it or not, is healthier. And the reason is because the child in that situation has some sense of predictability. In contrast, the child who grows up in a home where the father's an alcoholic, but he may drink on Monday, he may drink on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, he may not drink, Friday night he comes home after work, he's late because he has his paycheck and he sits down with the kid and he plays Monopoly for 6 hours, but then Saturday night he goes out drinking. When there's no predictability, there's no certainty. And if there's no certainty and there's no predictability, there's actually a much greater sense of stress that the child and other household members experience, and that will lead to the child experience much greater pathology as he grows and develops into adolescence and adulthood. There are certain psychological attitudes towards the abuser in complex trauma cases. Sometimes there's real hatred toward an abusive parent, as one can imagine from the child. Sometimes there's guilt. And I've seen this a million times where, a child will be in a home where there's abuse, not only to himself, but also to his mom. And the child will feel terribly guilty that he can't do more to protect his mom. He's small, the dad's large, but he still feels guilty that he's allowing, so to speak, his mother to experience the abuse. Sometimes the child will sympathize with a parent who is overwhelmed. And I've seen this many, many times too, where the child is physically abused and the child is not angry or upset. The child feels sympathy for the mom because she's working two jobs. She's trying to do her best. And the child says to me as an adult, I get it. Like, she was just overwhelmed. She was doing her best. I just can't blame her for being abusive towards me. If anything, I feel sympathy. Sometimes there's anger towards a passive abused parent. And I've seen this many times also. I'll see a situation where the child will say, I hate my mom because she stood by. And I'll inquire about it, and I'll say, your dad, as you described him, was a very large man. He would use objects such as belts and even rocks to hurt you and other family members. I'm not sure what your mom could have done. You lived in an isolated farming community. And the adult will say, she was my mom. She was there. She was supposed to protect me. Maybe she should have ran away with us, something. And that child feels less anger towards the abuser and more anger towards the mom, even though the mom was undoubtedly victimized in various ways as well. Some people develop indifference, emotional emptiness or apathy, and they become psychologically shut down because they're unable to properly process what has occurred. Some identify with the abuser. Some children who grew up see the abuser as powerful, as controlling, and redirects it in a way so that the victim thinks, well, maybe I should be powerful, maybe I should be controlling, maybe I'll be successful if I adopt those traits because I'll be able to protect myself. I'll be able to always be in situations where if I'm concerned about my safety, I can act in a way that's aggressive, but at least I'll be safe. Another major psychological attitude is that there's a very strong incident of alcohol and drug abuse among abusers in general. And sometimes the child or adolescent will emulate the drug addiction, especially if it's culturally valid, and especially if the child himself was introduced to drugs at a very early age. And I see this all the time where the child is introduced to alcohol or drugs as early as age 11 or 12. It's not uncommon among family members. There may be a history of alcoholics or drug abusers. There's alcohol and drug in the community. And we should therefore not be surprised that a victim of such systemic harms who develops complex trauma adopts the alcohol and drugs to emulate the abuser, but also ultimately to self-medicate. When trying to understand harm, and this is something I use in personal injury cases and other kind of cases, it's important to understand harm very broadly, to understand broadly what that victim's experience was like when he was or she was growing up in the home. And if you're constantly thinking about safety and curiosity, you have no ability to think about schoolwork and love and exploring and so on. There's a loss of neurological, intellectual malleability. There's a loss of emotional malleability, and you just can't blossom. So the person thinks, like, who am I? Do I matter? Do I have an impact? Am I nothing? Like, why am I in the universe? And the focus is on survival and not exploring the world. So I say this because, therefore, the harm that the person experiences usually affects them systemically in almost every area of their life. I speak about this after, but I do want to mention it now. One of the most important things is that, this is crucial, it creates a value system through which the child views the world. If you're in a home where there's constant abuse and neglect and so on, it's a value system. It's a pathological value system, but it's a value system nonetheless. Many of these clients grow up in a home, therefore, where the abusers don't feel shame. There's no empathy among family members. People may be indifferent to one another. It's also sometimes the case that you may have one child who's abused physically and another child who's not abused physically, or two children that are not abused physically. And the abuse is very parochial. And then the victim feels not just picked on, obviously, but the child feels targeted, and they think, if I'm targeted, there must be a reason that I am targeted. There must be something inherently wrong with me, or I must be deserving of this kind of negative focus. So this is, maybe I'll mention this again later, but again, I cannot overemphasize the importance of understanding that this creates a value system. I just want to contrast it with something. If you grow up in a home where there's generally healthy interaction, if you grow up in a home where there's people who generally like to read, and grow up in a home where everybody goes to school and maybe everybody goes to college, if you grow up in a home where in the summertime you play outside and you meet new people and it's about exploring and so on, that's a value system. Reading and having normal relationships, even if you're not religious or there's not any underlying ethical underpinning, it's a value system that you internalize. It's very important, therefore, to iterate and reiterate that these children are growing up with a value system they don't even realize it's a value system. That the pathology of repeated harm that they experience personally and systemically within the family creates a value system of harm. It's important to understand that as the child grows, he will make decisions and judgments and so on. In economics, a large part of psychology, a large part of law, especially with Richard Posner, who posits the rational player theory, that people make decisions based on our rational and self-interested needs. This is great to understand. It's just completely wrong. We make decisions based on our emotions, based on how we think about and feel about things. Once we've tapped into our emotions to make a decision, then retroactively we justify it by some rationality. So if the person grows up without the ability to develop healthy emotions or psychological reasoning, then certainly the decisions that they're going to make and the judgments are going to be, to at least some extent, irrational. I have in the PowerPoint lectures I give, especially for formal CLEs, I look at neurological and cognitive damage, many examples, and I've spoken about this, but basically with complex trauma, it wears and tears at the neurological system. The learning brain is dulled, as I mentioned. There's emotional system dysregulation. There's emotional equilibrium is thrown off. The person can be in a permanent state of terror. They may feel that there's just no exit door in their life. They just can't find any place where they feel safe. They never feel at ease. They can't process information. They can't internalize or cope with new information. Their memories are often shot. Their ability to understand their surroundings, judgment, planning, insight is also very damaged. They're damaged emotionally. They feel shame and self-blame, rage, helplessness, hypervigilance. They cannot process fight or flight issues. Their normal coping mechanisms psychologically may be completely undermined. They may feel very inadequate, worthless, stupid, useless about themselves. They may have a chronic distrust of themselves and others, a chronic sense of despair and doom. For some, they actually lose temporal focus, meaning that for some people in these situations, time just stands still. Normally we think of time in a very healthy way. We have our days set up, we have our weeks set up, we have our months set up, seasons. It's not unusual for people that have suffered complex trauma in these ways not to have a sense of, seasons or even years regarding the complex trauma. It just all melds together. People develop existential crises. They may feel that life has no meaning, it's nonsensical, their own existence has no real meaning, and so on. Many of these clients, as I said earlier, have a wide range of healthcare consequences. healthcare issues, somatic complaints, and so on. Many of these clients present with intellectual learning disabilities or limited education, as you can imagine. If you can't learn, I mean, obviously your ability to progress in school is going to be terribly impaired. Some of these clients are poorly educated. They may be illiterate even. They may have very poor ability to self-advocate. They may have a terrible time providing a proper narrative of what their experiences were. Their learning disabilities may be highlighted by disorganization, difficulty with time planning, abstract reasoning, inattention. Many have truancy. They may not value education at all. Many of these clients are actually victimized again by bullies in school because they have difficulty with school. They don't come from safe or stable households, and they're picked on. Some of these clients are marked for learning disorders or developmental delays, and in a sense they do, but really it needs to be understood in the context of what they experienced within the home because of the harms that they suffered. Sometimes the school system itself acts in loco parentis. They really, in the place of the parents, they evaluate the client. They provide remedial tutorial assistance, counseling, other programs, and so on. It could be very helpful. Sometimes I'll ask a client about their education, basic math skills, basic understanding about the world, and so on. Sometimes I'll ask a client, when is the last time you read a book for school? What were those books? Can you just give me in one or two sentences what those main issues or core ideas of the book or characters or plot line, whatnot? And the client almost inevitably cannot do it, and certainly not at an age-appropriate level. I do want to just mention in this context one thing, and that is a client that suffers systemic harms in childhood may have a perfectly good brain objectively. And, I just had a client who suffered complex trauma in childhood due to multiple harms. This guy was brilliant. He was an inner city kid who had read I don't know if it was the childhood or maybe it was the adult encyclopedia twice before he finished high school. I mean, that's an incredible undertaking. A brilliant kid who went on to college. But the damage was so insidious from his childhood that in various ways it came out in terms of his relationships with others, and he became a very self-destructive individual. Many of these clients present with separation anxiety disorder because in childhood, even though they're abused, they're always concerned about the well-being of their family, the integrity of the family system. Is a parent going to come? Is a parent going to go? Where are they going to live? And these children develop somatic issues. They don't want to go to school. They have chronic stomach aches. They want to sleep with their mommy and daddy, and so on. Many of these clients develop borderline personality disorder. I have a completely separate program on that, as I mentioned, which I promise to upload to YouTube in the next few weeks. Many of these clients present with chronic social and interpersonal negative issues. They may be socially awkward. They may feel shy. They may have social anxiety, interpersonal friction, not just like in school, but in the workplace where it really matters, and it may lead to repeated termination from their jobs. They become just very easily annoyed by others. Just underneath the surface, they're just a little bit angry and irritable. They have violence perhaps as a means of communication, or communication as a means of violence, and many of these individuals have personality disorders. Many of these clients present with ADHD, or they're ADHD-ish, and by that I mean they have inattention and hyperactivity because this is what they had when they were growing up. They were bombarded by these extraneous, negative, harmful external stimuli. They internalized it, and they're always a little bit on edge, hypervigilant, and to stave off this anxiety, to self-protect in this manner, they present in an ADA-ish way. The point is to understand objectively the presentation of the client, but to understand it also contextually with how the client presents to you at the time when the person's evaluated as it stands in contrast with the person's childhood development. Some of these clients also present ADD, meaning they don't seem to present with hyperactivity or impulsivity, but that their attention deficit is so overwhelming that is sufficiently damaging to their ability to function in a healthy way in their everyday life. Obviously, a huge area is PTSD. This occurs when the person has experienced or witnessed or is confronted with events that involve actual or threatened death or serious injury, or a threat to the person's physical integrity. There are stressors that the person responds to with intense fear and helplessness. The person may experience intrusive symptoms and may even re-experience the harm in earlier years in various ways, including nightmares. Many of these clients show avoidance, that they want to avoid people, places, experiences, even ideas at times, or social media that may trigger negative memories of the trauma. Some of these clients have negative alterations in cognition or mood. That cognition refers to how they think and process information. Mood, as you can imagine, refers to how they feel about themselves, but their actual mood. And some have sadness or anxiety or depression and so on. And last is alterations in arousal and reactivity. Many of these clients present with recurrent depressive disorders where they feel subjectively sad and empty. They find themselves intermittently crying. They're distressed and depressed with a low mood, helplessness, hopelessness, low energy, anhedonia. That is, they just don't seem to derive pleasure from everyday life. They have low self-esteem. They're just slowed down in general. They have low energy. They feel worthless. They may even have inappropriate guilt. They're often presenting with erratic sleep patterns or erratic appetite patterns now or in the past. And some may have discrete sleep disorders or eating disorders that may not be apparent until this is really inquired about. And their overall ability, and as I've said a million times, to focus and concentrate properly may be terribly impaired. A huge issue is that a lot of these clients have suicidality. Active suicidality occurs where you have a direct plan to hurt yourself, such as ingesting pills to end your life. Passive suicidality may occur when the client thinks, gee, what would it be like if I could sleep and sleep and sleep and not wake up so that my psychological pain would vanish. Some forms of this can include self-hatred. The person may feel useless or a burden. They may lack reciprocal connections to others. And this is often under the rubric of self-harm in general. It's an extremely complex problem that we're frankly not fully aware about, especially because completed suicides often occur in the context where in the hours, days, and even weeks and months before it occurs, we don't have complete information about the person or even older background evaluations. But what we do know is that suicidality emanates from helpless feelings of overwhelming despair and deep psychological pain. Some people can become habituated with pain, and that's good in the sense that they're able to function, but it's bad in the sense that they're able to function with the pain, and obviously it comes out somewhere. And at some point they may just experience something that overwhelms them, over the top in such a way that they become actively suicidal. And it's very important to understand that within this rubric of self-harm, there are many forms of destructive behaviors that should be considered. I would even include something like, rock climbing without gear, where there is a long history of many fatalities with when false move, but other forms as well, including I had a client, for example, not too long ago, who drove his motorcycle at ridiculously high speeds without a helmet on back roads where it was really very unsafe, and it just seemed like this person was looking in some way to harm themselves. Many of these clients present with panic attacks. Sometimes they may have a panic disorder. These are individuals that, their heart's beating very fast, a shortness of breath, chest tightening, trembling, shaking, may feel their choking, tummy aches, gastric problems. Sometimes the panic attacks are triggered by something very specific. It's good to know what the specific issue is because it is retroactively informative of the person's history of trauma. But very often, the panic attack seems to occur without a specific trigger, and that could be more alarming to the person because they're having this. It's basically a physiological breakdown. That's what a panic attack is. And not to know about it and not to know the etiology or why it's occurring, and yet your body's falling apart on you, can be very, very frightening. As I said before, many clients present with somatic problems. Symptoms can't be traced. In somatic problems, symptoms cannot be traced to any physical cause and not the result of substance abuse or another mental illness. People with somatoform disorder are not faking their symptoms. The pain and other problems they experience are real, and symptoms can significantly affect daily function. There's a sub-area of this, something called conversion disorder, which is a functional neurological symptom disorder. Someone presents like this, they can't move their arm. It's neuromuscular. Some people present with immune system dysfunctions. The most common issues that I see people present with, as I mentioned before, are headaches or migraine headaches, gastric problems, loss of hair, dermatological problems. Those seem to be the most common. Some clients present with dissociative disorders. When flight or flight responses are not available, then the only option is to psychologically or emotionally remove yourself from the situation and place yourself somewhere else. And that's dissociative disorder. These are conditions that involve disruptions or breakdowns of memory, awareness, identity, perception. People with dissociative disorders, it's thought use dissociation as a defense mechanism, and it's quite involuntary. Some clients, and this is I see much more often in trauma cases, present with fawning or freezing. If you're in a situation, you meet a bear in the forest, you're not going to fight the bear. You're going to lose. You're not going to run away from the bear because the bear can outrun you. But there is something called fawning and freezing. These are very important concepts where you're in a situation that's dangerous or perceived to be dangerous and harm may be imminent. The person may fawn. They will try to mimic or placate the abuser or the potential danger, hoping that they will calm down, or you're mimicking their emotional level, behavior, and so on. That's fawning. Oh, it's okay. Calm down. Freezing is another major area where, as you can imagine, if you encounter a danger, you freeze. You don't move. You try not to think. You try not to think about anything around you. And that's actually, for some people, a very good strategy. Some people have a kind of superficial imposed freezing. I know people that have grown up in abusive homes, and they freeze themselves in their room. And their parents never see them. Their siblings don't interact with them. And they go to their room and they read, they listen to music, and they do their homework. And, they turn 18 and they go to college and they do well. It's a kind of freezing where they seclude themselves. The more common kind of freezing occurs in the immediate vicinity to the potential harm. This is also quite common in abusive homes that are very small, where there's no room to go hide. In other words, you're always kind of in a general area. There's, let's say, a kitchen, living room, dining room that's studio style, and you may have 1 or 2 bedrooms, 1 bedroom for the parents and maybe 1 bedroom for 3 or 4 children. Some of these children, as a result, because the home is so small, then turn to the streets for safety, even though obviously the streets are not the place to be because there are all sorts of dangers there. Many clients, as I mentioned, turn towards alcohol, drugs, all sorts of addictions. And when that's the case, you want to know the who, what, where, when, why. When did it start? Why did it start? Who influenced you? How much drugs you take, and so on. I had a client the other day, a murder case in Chicago, and this client used no hard drugs in the context of some very, very serious problems, but other very serious drugs, including abusing Percocet, Xanax, and other drugs. It's important to understand that some of these clients are psychotic even though they don't present with psychosis. There's 2 main areas of psychosis, delusions, which are false beliefs, and hallucinations, which are false perceptions. With false beliefs, the person is often paranoid. They're quite guarded, suspicious of others. They have a low sense of trust in others, often because they have a low sense of trust in themselves. And the person has had to be quite guarded in an adaptive sense in their childhood in order to be hypervigilant about their safety. Hallucinations are false perceptions. The most common are auditory and visual hallucinations where the person, for example, I see this quite commonly, where the person is walking down the street, they think their name is being called, they turn around, but nobody is there, or they see shadows at night. This is rooted in hypersensitivity to real or perceived dangers that the individual experienced in the surrounding environment. Some clients develop factitious disorder. It's a condition in which the person acts as if he or she has an illness by deliberately producing or faking or exaggerating symptoms for psychological or emotional gain. This is an actual psychiatric disorder. The person needs help. They don't understand their issues. They're too frightened. They can't articulate them. A couple percentage of people in emergency rooms present with factitious disorder. They may say their arm hurts, but really they're there. They're not lying about their arm. They're there because they need help, and often not just psychological, emotional help, but social service supports as well. This stands in contrast to malingering. Malingering is the feigning or faking of symptoms for personal or pecuniary gain. And, the most textbook example is someone walks in front of a car on the street. In order to be hit, they suffer relatively minor injuries, but injuries nonetheless. Or a person who fakes injuries altogether because they're trying to get perhaps government benefits, such as disability benefits. Many of these clients clearly with complex trauma will present with antisocial personality disorder or psychopathy, but I cannot emphasize enough that the proper way to first consider, above everything else, this person's presentation is rooted in their psychosocial clinical history of harms, abuses, neglect, and so on that the person experienced in the home, community, school system, and so on. Many people with complex trauma histories, as you can imagine, present with atypical presentations. They may even have subclinical issues. It doesn't mean that the issues are not real. Some of these clients never get help. They're too embarrassed. They don't have the financial resources. For some clients, psychiatric care is anathema to their cultural background. Psychiatric diagnoses are stigmatized. I see many clients who gain spiritual support from their church, pastor, or fellow parishioners. It's a very serious matter when you see someone who's never had help, and obviously they need a great deal of help. And, the prosecutor, the judge may think, well, this person's had so many problems. Surely at some point this person would have gained significant help. More often what I see are children or adults that do gain help, but the help that they gain is really very inadequate. It's insufficient. And the help is not the kind that first systemically evaluates all of the issues that the individual has, family members, household, and so on. Thank you for listening today. What I've tried to do is present for the criminal defense lawyer a much broader understanding of complex trauma, rooted in systemic and repeated physical, sexual, emotional, and other abuses and harms and neglect that the client may have experienced and encountered in childhood and adolescence. And the one huge great takeaway is not only how these harms cause complex trauma affecting the person's thinking and emotions, behavior, and so on, but how it's a value system, how the person may present as psychopathic or antisocial, but really it's an outgrowth of the pathology that this person experienced growing up. Please don't hesitate to email me. I'll be happy to send back a redacted copy. I hope this was helpful to criminal defense lawyers, and keep your emails and calls coming. They're always very, very welcome, and I will see you next time. Thank you.